A good morning and a good evening to everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Australia-UK Housing Network. So for anyone who's new to the network, it was launched in late 2023 as an initiative really designed to bring together leading academics, policymakers, and housing professionals from both Australia and the UK with the intention to share dialogue and research and policy innovation in relation to our many shared housing challenges. Now, of course, that shared language, culture, institutions, and indeed our shared housing problems, do relate to the colonial experience. And so I want to begin this meeting by, of course, acknowledging that those of us joining from Australia are on First Nations land. I myself am zooming in from the lands of the Darawal people, and I want to acknowledge the continued custodianship and connection to the lands that the Darawal people have where I live, and pay respect to elders past and present. So you're very welcome if you would like to also acknowledge the country that you're dialing in from to do so in the chat. So today we are coming together to talk about critical junctures in housing policy, or really critical turning points. And I think this is such a privilege for those of us who research policy, which of course is always sort of a rapidly evolving space, but also a space where it seems like nothing changes. We're in these sort of two spheres. But we rarely get a chance to sort of look historically and in depth at how policies evolved. And we have an opportunity to do that today in a comparative context. So what we're doing today is we're going to look at critical junctures or turning points in housing policy in Australia and the UK, placing a critical eye on policy changes. And our key speakers today are Rae Dufty Jones and Keith Jacobs, who will then there'll be a response from Laura James and from Mark Stevens. So I think you probably know most of our speakers, but just in case, Rae Dufty Jones, sorry, is Professor of Urbanism in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. She's a very experienced policy analyst and researcher whose career has spanned both, the academic and industry spheres. Keith Jacobs is Emeritus Professor in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania, and he, of course, has an extensive track record in housing policy research, both in Australia and in the UK. So the format will be that we will first hear from Rae, who will give us some perspectives from Australia. Then Keith will talk to us about the UK housing policy, and then we'll have a response from Laura James and from Mark Stevens. And then we'll open it up to general discussion. So I think to move us along, to get us to our dinners, to our work days, whatever it is we're doing next, I'm going to hand over to Rae.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll just go into presentation mode. So can everyone see that okay? Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And I just want to pay my own acknowledgement. I'm joining you from Wongal country on the Eora Nation, which is near Burwood in Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations persons that might be joining us today. So yes, so thank you very much. Catherine, can I just be reminded how long you want us to speak for?
You have 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes, but what I'll do is when you're at the 15-minute, I'll just put something in the chat.
Yep, no troubles. I will do that. I'll try to stick to time though, but thank you very much. So yeah, look, housing policy in Australia and the UK has, as this seminar titles framed around, shaped by critical junctures. So these are key pivotal moments when existing policy trajectories become destabilised and alternate pathways emerge, and particular political choices lock in new institutional arrangements that fundamentally alter the relationship between housing and the state. These critical junctures represent periods of heightened political contingency where hopefully taken for granted assumptions about housing production and consumption are challenged, creating openings for transformation of housing systems. Historical analysis is essential for understanding these junctures, as it reveals how seemingly inevitable outcomes that are often contested political choices made under specific circumstances that could have unfolded differently given different circumstances. By examining these critical junctures historically, we can question the present configuration of housing systems and identify the political decisions, institutional changes, and discursive shifts that both produce and are produced by contemporary crises of affordability and access to housing. So this historical perspective reveals not only how we arrived at the current moment of a housing crisis, but also illuminates how alternative policy pathways, particularly those linking housing provision in this instance to secondary industry development, remain latent and are also produced through these crises as outcomes in response to them. So the importance of historical approaches to housing research has been widely recognised, with scholars like Cole arguing succinctly that nothing serves the view of the future better than a sound grasp of the past. Historical perspectives offer more holistic understandings of housing issues, confronting both past and present populations and policymakers. However, as Jacobs notes, while Foucauldian approaches have provided important insights into how housing policy shapes outcomes, there remains a tendency for this approach to privilege the role of discourse over and above economic processes, temporal agencies, and technological developments. So for this paper, I won't spend too long on it, but to have an understanding of the theoretical framing for it, I've adopted what Bacci and Goodwin have developed as what the problem is represented to be, or the WPR approach to policy analysis. And this approach examines how policies produce problems as particular types of problems, rather than simply addressing pre-existing or kind of independent or ontologically stable issues. The WPR approach uses policy texts as levers to open up reflections on forms of governing and their associated effects, making visible the politics involved in constituting particular problems and their subsequent proposed solutions. So recent housing crises have generated extensive critical analysis of housing assetisation and financialisation, with scholars tracing quite effectively how homes have been systematically transformed from use values providing shelter into exchange values, serving as investment vehicles and financial instruments. The literature has demonstrated how housing financialisation represents this culmination of decades-long policy choices that dismantled post-war social housing frameworks and embedded residential property within global financial circuits. This historical analysis has also been particularly crucial in revealing how processes of deregulation, privatisation and financial innovation, particularly since the 1980s, created new markets, treating housing as tradable assets rather than simply social infrastructure. But what I want to critique or bring us back to is, what about those housing policy paths that we haven't taken? And so this paper intervenes in this existing scholarship, particularly that focusing on financialisation, by examining how housing is and continues to be an area considered as enacting or catalysing secondary industry development and productivity agenda. And so it's been repeatedly engaged with, but ultimately often cast aside in favour of policies that advance the interests of financial and private land development sectors alternatively. So while the financialisation literature has effectively documented the triumph of market-led approaches, less attention has been paid to the alternative policy paradigms that were also actively considered and continue to be actively considered, but often have been rejected during these critical junctions of housing policy development. So for me, this paper is arguing that the outcomes of housing policy debates, particularly those that preceded that 1980s period where we see this kind of almost domination of financialised and deregulation of housing markets, kind of take precedence. What I'm looking at is the 1970s to see how they have continued to give and ongoing significant implications for contemporary Australian housing policy. So in the second half of this paper, I'll examine two federal government inquiries, the 1974 task force to investigate modern housing techniques and the 1978 inquiry into the cost of housing. However, before we go on, what I would like to do is have a quick look at how the industrialisation as approach to housing crises has evolved, particularly in the Australian housing context. So before the 20th century, prefabrication and housing developed mainly in response to colonial expansion. And so this is why it's of particular interest for me, coming from Australia as a settler colonial nation state. So prefabrication was a response to colonial expansion, industrialization, and urbanization. As early as the 17th century, however, prefabricated timber houses were shipped from England to North America and Australia to essentially provide rapid shelter for settlers. The 19th century saw quite marked advances in transport and manufacturing during this time, including iron frame structures and mail order kits being developed in the United States. So the Sears house is a classic example of that. Both of these demonstrate how industrial processes could be applied to domestic construction. And these innovations were driven by the need for speed, portability, and cost efficiency, but their decline often came about from cultural attachment to traditional building methods, concern about durability, and the limits of early industrial techniques. In Australia, prior to 1900, prefabricated housing played a significant role in supporting colonisation and settlement, particularly during periods of rapid population growth, such as the gold rushes in the 1850s. Timber cottages, often manufactured in Britain, such as Henry Manning's famous portable colonial cottages, which you can see an example of, I think, in the top left-hand corner. They were shipped in parts and assembled on arrival to provide quick, practical shelters for settlers and officials. These prefabricated dwellings were attractive because they could be transported long distances by ship, erected with minimal skilled labour, and adapted to local conditions where building materials or trades were scarce. They essentially provided an essential stopgap solution to the pressing need for accommodation. And what often would happen is that their use declined as local industries matured, and trained settlers in the building trades would more permanently arrive in Australia. So while prefabricated housing was important in Australia's early colonial settlement, its use reflected wider imperial and industrial patterns. In North America, prefabricated timber houses were shipped to England as early as the 17th century, but they were soon eclipsed by on-site construction. In India, prefabricated buildings were often used by the British military and colonial administrators, but remained largely a stopgap for those groups of settlers. However, in Australia, reliance on prefabricated dwellings in the 19th century was more sustained and widespread, particularly during the Gold Rush era, and because there was just ongoing limited local supply chains. The failure of prefabricated housing in Australia was further compounded by, however, deep-rooted cultural and regulatory and industry resistance that emerged once the crisis or urgency subsided. Prefab housing would often become stigmatised as emergency or temporary solutions, while consumer preferences would regularly shift back towards traditional customisable housing forms. The construction industry's inherently fragmented, locally orientated structure would often reassert itself during these periods after the crisis. And then they would then threaten established roles of the manufacturing sector in turn. Furthermore, financial institutions would often not favour manufactured or mass-produced housing, often preferring the more traditional made construction homes. So unlike other industries that successfully adopted mass production, construction maintained and continues to maintain, for the most part, a craft-based, site-specific method. It is often referred to as the industry that time forgot. We do see this aspiration from prefabrication really shift in the early 20th century, where it evolves from being a mode of kind of supplying colonial outposts with kit houses and niche applications, to instead being kind of embracing a more kind of modernist ideal of the time. So spurred on again by labour shortages in the building trades, there is also accompanied by it an enthusiasm for the machine age and experiments with new technologies such as reinforced concrete, steel framing, and panelised timber. So architects like Le Corbusier casts the house as a machine for living. He promotes the idea that mass production and standardisation could modernise domestic life. And governments play a varying role in this adoption. So in the UK, for example, the Addison Act funded large council housing schemes that trialled prefabricated methods. In Weimar, Germany, municipal housing estates pioneered system building techniques. And in the Soviet Union, industrial combined rolled out constructivist worker housing as part of socialist planning. So, however, by the eve of World War II, prefabrication had become closely tied to state-backed housing policy in much of North America and Europe, marking the transition to this idea of industrialised construction. However, in Australia, this trajectory diverged from these other international trends. For this nation state, prefabrication remained important in supplying homes for more frontier settlements and rural towns and mining regions where skilled labour and materials were scarce. However, for the most part, prefabrication was not seen as a solution by either individuals, the private sector. In short, while prefabrication in Europe and America evolved through state-driven mass housing policies, in Australia, it remained purely a supplementary technique rather than a central policy tool. What I also want to point out with Le Corbusier and kind of the ethos of this time is that his arguments for mass-produced housing was firmly rooted in the idea of economics and productivity. He saw part of the quality of mass-produced housing as lying in its industrial efficiency, ability to reduce costs, and the economies of scale as being inseparable from good design. He insisted that the economic law inevitably governs our acts and our thoughts. Just as the motor car became a mass-produced tool accessible to all, so too should the house be conceived as a rational product of industry. For him, architecture's task was aligned with this new spirit, and in many ways, these ideals of industrialisation and mass production were also increasingly brought into play in the post-World War II reconstruction. So by the time we get to post-World War II and the post-war reconstruction commission in Australia, industrial construction and prefabrication is being embraced as the most effective response to what is seen as a significant housing crisis at the time. So unlike after World War I, the crisis was framed as a national problem tied to social stability, reconstruction, and argued that the Commonwealth would need to take a much deeper involvement in housing policy. In this context, prefabrication was not only framed as a technical solution to housing shortages, but also as an economic opportunity. Reports during this time emphasised that prefabrication could address labour shortages and bottlenecks in traditional construction by shifting more of the work into factories. At the same time, it was promoted as a vehicle for industrial development. Policymakers also highlighted that investment in factories, manufacturing capacity, and the related supply chains could actually stimulate employment and diversify the national economy beyond on-site construction. So this was more than just a short-term stopgap to solve a historical housing crisis. It was about building a sustained national economic program behind it. So, for example, in 1945, the New South Wales Housing Commission struck an agreement with the Swedish government to import several thousand prefabricated timber houses. Sweden had escaped much of the wartime destruction and had spare industrial capacity, and so offered complete house kits that could be shipped, unloaded, and rapidly erected in Australian suburbs. In a way, it was the first instance of IKEA in New South Wales. So each kit included walls, roof sections, walls, and fittings, all pre-cut and standardised. The appeal was speed. A Swedish prefab could be assembled in weeks rather than months and helped to tackle Sydney's severe post-war shortage. Okay, so after 1945, the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement sustained these industrialised constructions. However, over subsequent decades and successive Commonwealth State Housing Agreements, what we saw was essentially particularly beginning in 1956, the dilution and the renegotiation as the Commonwealth shifted priorities away from the mass public provision towards instead supporting home ownership through building societies and private finance. This change reduced the scale and certainty of demand for prefabrication, making it difficult to justify continued investment in factories or large import programs, while at the same time expanding the role of private lending institutions in housing delivery. At the same time, broader economic and cultural settings reinforced the decline of industrial construction. As post-war reconstruction wound down, the rationale for retooling wartime factories and absorbing returned service people also lost its force. Culturally, political narratives increasingly equated the Australian dream with suburban home ownership in brick veneer dwellings, a vision that was promoted by both the Commonwealth Government and private developers. So by the late 1960s, these combined policy shifts meant that industrialised construction in Australia had become once again a marginal alternative. It was purely a post-war expedient and not something that anyone really wanted to pursue. In the meantime, the financial sector and the private property developers emerged as enduring beneficiaries of the new housing policy regime with a redirected or an ideologically redefined Commonwealth state housing agreement supporting the development of these sectors instead of secondary industries. From the late 1960s into the 1970s, the housing system that had underpinned the post-war Australian boom, however, began to show signs of strain. Strong population growth from both the baby boom and large-scale post-war migration had begun to slow. The cost of servicing new land grew, and land release processes lagged behind demand, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. By the early 1970s, house prices and rents were rising more quickly than incomes, and the affordability that had defined the 1950s and 60s era of near universal home ownership in Australia was slipping out of reach for younger and lower income households. Again, it sounds like history repeating itself again if you think about contemporary Australia today. The problem was also exacerbated by a steady decline in public housing provision, with Commonwealth state housing agreements successively reducing funding to state housing commissions over the 1960s and early 1970s. By the 1970s, waiting lists for public housing had grown substantially, and housing authorities increasingly targeted their assistance to low-income or needy tenants. This shift not only limited the supply, but also entrenched stigma attached to these estates. As a result, housing in the 1970s was constructed as a more complex problem than the simple shortages of the post-war period. It was increasingly defined in terms of affordability and access, as well as an urban policy issue linked to sprawl, transport congestion, and the cost of infrastructure. When the Whitlam government came into power, it found itself having to manage another housing crisis in much the way that Curtin and Chifley had to do when they came to power in the early 1940s. However, unlike the 1940s, the 1970s represented a pivotal moment in Australian housing policy, where we see essentially the federal government pursue two fundamentally different and quite clear different philosophical approaches to addressing the nation's housing crisis. And we look at this through principally two inquiries, the first being the Task Force on Modern Housing Techniques, which embodied an enduring belief that industrialised construction methods, including prefabrication and modular housing systems, could deliver the scale, speed and cost efficiencies needed to solve housing affordability. And then opposed to the inquiry into cost of housing that was led by the Fraser government in the latter half of that decade, which reflected a growing influence of economic rationalist thinking that positioned the financial sector and deregulation of that sector with additional market liberalisation as the primary mechanisms for improving housing access and affordability. These dual inquiries capture a critical juncture where Australia's housing policy stood at a crossroad between the industrial modernisation approach that had periodically emerged during previous crises and the emerging neoliberal framework that would increasingly dominate policy thinking, setting the stage for a decisive shift in how governments understood their role in housing provision and market intervention. How am I going for time, Catherine? Am I running out of time?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm so sorry.
No,
I'm
that's
going
okay.
to I'm going to skip forward because essentially these what I would like to be able to conclude with is how these policies and responses to housing challenges or problems in Australia continue today, and you can see re-emerging in response to housing crises once again. So the contrasting approaches of these two federal inquiries illuminate a pivotal transformation in Australian housing policy thinking during the 1970s that extended far beyond technical questions of construction methods or cost reduction. The task force conducted under the Whitlam government embodied a final attempt to apply industrial modernisation logic to housing within the broader framework of comprehensive housing and regional development policy. Their technocratic optimism about industrialised construction as a solution to housing costs represented continuity with early crisis eras approaches that positioned the government as an active agent of economic transformation through direct intervention in production processes. By contrast, the Fraser government's inquiry conducted a smaller but more narrowly focused investigation that was dominated by financial sector and land development interests. It also marked a decisive shift towards market-oriented solutions that prioritised regulatory reform and institutional coordination over technological innovation. The Fraser's inquiry's emphasis on government efficiency, monetary policy and deregulation reflected broader ideological changes that would reshape Australian housing policy for the next 4 to 5 decades, positioning planning processes and community resistance rather than industrial backwardness as the primary obstacles to housing affordability, and establishing the framework for the financialised approach to housing that would dominate subsequent policy development. And I'll leave it there because I want us to be able to listen to Keith. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rae. I think we'll hand over straight to Keith, and then I think we'll have a joint discussion at the end. But I'd welcome anyone who has questions, please pop them in the chat, and then we can come back to them in the discussion period. Thank you. Thanks, Rae. Sorry, Keith, just unmute yourself.
Good. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that, Rae, enormously. I kind of feel more qualified to talk about Australian housing than UK because I actually left the UK in 2002. So I'm going to have to give a slightly different talk to yours, Rae, in the sense it's going to be a set of observations really reflecting on how we've misunderstood housing policy and how we still continue to misunderstand housing policy. Now, in terms of sharing my slides, the slides they're really just kind of notes for me, but just to remind me how I do this, I just share, don't I? So that's
Just, yeah, the little green button in the middle bottom line of the screen. If you just
okay.
hit that one.
Yep. Okay, and then it's there, and then I just do play from start. Is that right? Is that working?
Now it is, yep. And then if you just want to select, yeah, play from start, that should work.
Excellent. Okay, so everyone can see the slides, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, well, as I said, it's not going to be a kind of talk, it's just really a set of observations. And I've called it Critical Junctions in UK Housing Policy, 1945 to 2025, but I don't really want to take the argument that there is a crisis in housing. Quite the opposite. I think things are working extremely well for most people. The reason it's in the newspapers is that more and more low-income and middle-class householders are being affected by being excluded from home ownership in the UK, and that's the reason there's been so much interest in the media. Do I see any sign that things are going to change in the UK, judging by what's happening now and what's happened in the past? No, is the short term, and I'll try and explain why I think that's the case. So the word crisis I think is totally inappropriate. We all use it, but I think it's a mistake because crisis seems to suggest there's a temporary kind of difficulty which can all be overcome and then we can return to some kind of normality. But if you look at the last 50 years or even further back, you can actually see the situation of the UK is actually been a persistently clear set of circumstances where states intervene basically in the interests of capital, that the money invested in housing is mainly through commodified housing and only on rare exceptions or certain brief periods has there been a commitment to decommodified housing. Now, all of you are probably thinking, well, there's still investment in social housing, but let's get quite clear. Most of the subsidies and the money in the UK is generated to serve people with capital. So all the UK subsidies to landlords, often it's called housing benefit or whatever, actually is there for landlords. It's not actually a benefit for people who are excluded from home ownership. Certainly perceived that way, but the actual money ends up in the pockets of investors. So that's the argument is let's get rid of the word crisis when we discuss housing, because it lets policymakers, I think, off the hook to kind of give the sense that a little bit of tinkering can take place and a few legislative interventions will actually make a huge difference. They won't. There's been no evidence, in my view, that any short-term fix has actually worked in Britain. All those people who proclaimed after 2008 global financial crisis and even during COVID that there was new initiatives underway which is going to shift the balance of interest towards people who are excluded. That has proved spectacularly wrong. There has been a time, I think, in the 1950s and 60s when there was a brief shift towards the interest of those excluded. But I think other than that, basically it's been a one form of trajectory, which is simply that the state intervenes to shore up the interests of wealth and capital. But it does it in ways which is quite clever. So it often gives the impression of intervening in ways which actually address housing inequality. So these are the arguments I really want to say. Let's just look at 1950 and compare what actually happened over the last 50 years. Sorry, I've got to go back there, haven't I? This is the house prices, and just see how incredibly expensive UK housing is now. That's the average price of a home. We can see that housing is now not just simply a place to live. I mean, all of you are familiar with this. Housing's not just simply a place to live, but it's become an object which actually generates wealth and security for people. So it's increasingly become a form of investment as much as a place to live. And that's reflected in the house prices. So why is that happening? Because basically lots of people are making huge amounts of money from housing, and that's going to remain. What are the consequences of this kind of arrangement is that basically the people who are paying for the profits are generally those people who are renters in the UK. It's their work and time and labour which is actually securing the profits of landlords, and I say homeowners as well. Shortage of accommodation is not something which is accidental. It's actually necessary for profitability. Let's just have a look very, very quickly at the success of governments and the private house building industry to actually deliver on housing starts and completions. And it's pretty woeful. I mean, the big shift really was in the period around from the 1950s right the way through up until the mid 1970s, when there was huge and effective house building programs. I was very interested in the work of Patrick Dunleavy, who tried to argue, and I think very, very convincingly, that the big municipalisation which took place in the 1960s and 1970s in the UK is best understood rather as a crisis of profitability within the private rental market and home ownership. And large construction companies like Taylor Woodrow and others put huge pressure on governments to actually direct resources to invest in public housing. It wasn't somehow that the Conservatives had suddenly found, a belief that municipal housing was a good thing. They were basically lent on by their supporters to actually invest in public housing because of the crisis of profitability which had affected private house building during that period. And I think that's a very crucial period, the 1950s and 60s, because in a way it provides us with insights which I think still hold true today. But it's always the forces of capital which have been persuasive. I think what tends to confuse academics and housing researchers is often the language of housing policies dressed up in the rhetoric of the need and addressing inequality. But that's just the front, it's the cover. And if you actually look at the large interventions which have taken place over the last 50 or so years, it's always been interventions which has benefit the interest of speculators, homeowners, and landlords. Whatever we hear about the benefits to low-income households, it's often in the form of subsidies to landlords. And the whole arguments which are made when housing is addressed for low-income people is often made that you need to provide more disposable income to those households to actually achieve home ownership. Hence all the subsidies through rental assistance, which do nothing, in my view, to actually address the housing crisis other than line the pockets of investors and landlords. So what's been happening with public housing and home ownership and private rented? Well, there it's very clear that in the 1950s, there was a huge private rental sector, some 20% of the overall stock. It crashed in the 1970s and really up until the mid-1980s when it was resurrected by the Conservative government. But if you actually look at the period of the 60s and 70s, and I was old enough to remember the municipalisation which took place, many landlords found it very difficult to make profits from their housing stock. Wages were fairly low. There wasn't that much opportunity to raise rents. And landlords were very keen in many cities to actually sell off their stock to the local authorities. And in London and other large cities, municipalisation took place, supported actually by Conservatives and Labour administrations. I think the big change happened in the mid-70s when there was some pushback from some investors to put pressure on the Heath government to actually reduce the incentives for municipalisation. Of course, all of you will be familiar with the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979 and the right to buy. And there we saw a huge increase in home owner occupation and a collapse in the public housing stock. And that's been a huge disaster for the UK, which we're now seeing the consequences very clearly. The fact that there's so little public housing or social housing in the UK has been, I think, catastrophic to the economy. It's one of the major reasons why economic growth in the UK has been so disappointing. But basically, as far as I see it, as living in Australia, is that most young people who are living now, who are renters, are spending huge amounts of their income to the landlord. And that means their capacity to spend money in the wider economy is severely curtailed. You make the same argument with homeowners. Homeowners, particularly first-time buyers, are hugely indebted, and therefore their capacity to actually spend money in the overall economy is very limited. So you've got a very big problem in the UK, which is a suppression of aggregate demand, basically caused by very high house prices and high rents. And I don't think any government is willing to address that issue for the simple reason there's an electoral majority of homeowners and investors, which at the moment is bigger than all those people who are subsequently disadvantaged. You've also got an electoral cycle, which makes it very difficult for any politician from any party to actually put in place measures which will generate a radical shift in housing policy. The fact that policies which could be very progressive can easily be overturned by a new government which is in opposition to those reforms is a real challenge, I think, for long-term reform. And a good example is that the governments of the Labour Party in I think the 60s and the 70s Labour administration invested in public housing, but many of those investments were reversed by the incoming Conservative administration and the right to buy policies. So how you protect public assets in the future is a very difficult issue for politicians, which I really can't see easily addressed in the political system we have. So I've kind of covered this a little bit, but there was a consensus in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, and that was really the fact that wages were very low, that there wasn't a huge potential for people to become homeowners, and public housing was a necessary component to actually really restart the economy after the huge problems of the Second World War. Private landlordism, I mean, this is one of the fascinating things, and I'd be interested in discussion, but conservatives and right-wing people saw landlordism as extremely problematic for the same reasons as people did on the left. It's fundamentally parasitic in the sense its only way of securing profitability is to extract value from renters. There's no other way. You can either push up prices or produce poor quality private rental properties, but the way in which profits are generated has to be a squeeze on the people living there. And what's really bizarre is how the Conservatives embrace private landlordism as somehow a good thing and pushed back against supply side solutions to housing into favour of demand side policies, which basically reward investors. I've mentioned the profitability crisis already in private house building. I've always felt that it's profitability which actually generates the big changes in housing policy. It's nothing about the goodwill of politicians and their aspirations to address inequality. It's basically profitability drives housing policy. I'd be interested if people think there's a different way of understanding housing in the UK, but I always think it's profitability and the opportunities for profit, which explains most developments over the last 50 years. Obviously, there was a shift in Conservative Party thinking towards monetarism and reducing the role of the welfare state. That really came about because of the huge inflationary period following the oil crisis in the early 70s and well, I suppose it was the Middle East conflict in 73 when there was mass inflation in Britain, which basically had huge big pressures. But it meant that the solution in terms of how the Conservatives and even Labour they actually thought that it was necessary to reduce the welfare state and incentivise business. And we're still living with the consequences of that now. Obviously, the Conservatives in their 18-year period in power tried to see public housing as emblematic of welfare failure. And that was very, very important, of course. If you wanted to encourage people living in public housing to aspiring homeowners, you had to trash the brand. You couldn't possibly say that public housing was working successfully. You had to somehow put in place an ideology that somehow saw that public housing was only really there for people in dire need, and anyone who was a proper citizen had to engage or embrace public housing. The reduction in funds for local authority housing and the maintenance of stock was basically a huge amount of the Thatcher public expenditure cuts. And we saw the incentives for homeowners massively expanded in that period with tax relief and also demand side subsidies to landlords in the form of housing benefit and other tenant subsidies. So what's been happening since the 1990s? And this is where my history gets a bit patchy because I left in 2003. But as far as I see it, there was a sustained support for landlord investment by the Conservatives rather than investment in public and social housing. Of course, there was investment in social housing, but it was dwarfed by the huge subsidies to landlords and the right to buy legislation and the encouragement of landlords to actually buy local authority stock. Obviously, there's been an increase in funds since the Starmer administration has come into power. We know that's happening now. The strange thing I've always found about UK housing policy is the obsession with planning as somehow being an impediment to, to public housing and social housing and new building generally. There's a huge amount of land banking in the UK where developers basically buy up land, hold on to it. They're very reluctant to release it, but they use planning as a way to, in a way, distract attention from their own business model, which basically requires a housing shortage. Why is housing such a big issue now? You're all familiar with that. It's always been around. It's not a crisis at all. It's been a sustained and systematic structural arrangement. It's just simply now more middle class households are actually now being affected, particularly if they're renters, and even, dare I say it, the sons and daughters of Conservative MPs are now actually experiencing a housing crisis. Many academics have written about the bank of mum and dad. That's going to be increasingly so, and that actually is driving new forms of inequality in ways in which occupation in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s did. We now have housing tenure actually accentuating class quality. So one of the biggest class divides now in the UK is, are your parents or your family going to provide you with the funds to become a first-time buyer? And if you're not able to get those funds, your life is going to be much more difficult than it would be if you do have financial support from your mum and dad. Bit of a rush, but so what are the conclusions? Really, one can say, well, I was guilty of this, as probably many other people who are listening, that we always have overemphasized, I think, significantly, the importance of policy legislation. Always done that. We always get very, very excited about legislation, think this is a turning point in housing history. I remember reading stuff by Hal Pawson. I know Hal's not here, but Hal got very excited about the changes taking place after the COVID, thinking there was going to be a new direction in housing policy, and also after the global financial crisis. I have to say they appeared very, very short-lived. There's been no change, no U-turn, no significant shift in housing policy over the last 50 years. One exception, I think, is the push towards decommodification at a brief moment in the 60s and 70s because of the crisis of profitability in the private rental sector. Rae's quite right. We need a historical frame to understand any developments in housing. I think that point has been well made. Don't see housing in any other way except as a tool for economic policymaking. I think that's the most important point I want to make. Basically, housing is not really an end in itself. It's a means to an end, and it's economic policymaking. The state is very, very active. The market is a misnomer. It's not really a market. It's a rigged system which basically privileges capital over the expense of labour. And as far as I can see, it sounds like I'm very, very pessimistic. I'm not. I just think I'm a realist. I actually see no indication at all in any form there's going to be any steps taken to address the situation in the UK or in Australia. And I'd be interested to hear what other people think, but I just honestly cannot see a situation where the electoral system we have, the form by which politics takes place in both Australia and the UK, electoral systems which last for 3 or 5 years, that governments have the possibility to actually put in place radical reforms when you've got a 2/3 society made up of investors and homeowners at the expense of renters who basically are shafted in the system we have. Eventually, you might say, well, renters are going to become a bigger majority, and eventually that will mean there will be changes in the electoral outcomes. But that's going to be a long, long way. And the other depressing point is that renters get very, very excited about the housing crisis. But as soon as they become homeowners, they have an interest in seeing the value of property rise. So the big kind of conundrum for all people engaged with housing research or even housing politicians or anyone is how you generate a reform process where most of the population, whatever they say about housing affordability, they do not want to see the value of property fall. And again, I'd be interested in if people have got some kind of suggestion or kind of way of seeing the housing situation, which I've kind of roughly described in a different way to how I presented in this talk. So thanks very much. That was a rush, but in a way it gives more opportunity for us to discuss and talk.
Thank you so much, Keith. And I think there's a lot of provocations there. So what we're gonna turn it over to two of our discussants first to provide a response, and everyone else can get their thoughts and their questions ready. So I want to hand over first to Laura James from the Australian Centre for Housing Research at the University of Adelaide to provide a short response, and then we'll go to Professor Mark Stevens. Go ahead, Laura.
We can hear me, yeah?
We can hear you, yeah.
Thank you very much to you, Catherine, and also to speakers. tremendously enjoyed the presentations. They've given a lot to think about, and I'll be very, very quick so that we can actually hear from lots of other people. My comments are quite broad across both of yours. Think I'll start with yours, Ray. I thought the approach from Barchi of like the WPR approach is really excellent. What I really liked about it were a few things. Like as I said, these are just observations. Find the kind of like, I don't know if I'm misreading it, but the kind of unit of analysis in that approach is like text and narrative. And I find that quite refreshing, especially, with the idea of policy. But again, I also find it quite similar on policy in a way that, like Peter Phibbs's policy capture, or it's not his, of course, but he did a housing paper on it. And also from political science, ideas of like issue ownership, which I'm not sure if they're going to do anything useful, but perhaps they might. I don't know. I did actually think that issue ownership might be a lovely focus swap from home ownership. I'm not really sure, but that was interesting for me. But I also think it's quite interesting to see how WPR might play out, like in times of climate change and like digital transformations and participations and AI. I think that's really interesting, and I wonder also, like especially given what you were saying about like the kind of like cookie cutter housing that we might have, and I wonder if focusing on the problem and like problematization, like where like as Foucault said, which is what the WPR is grounded in, like concepts or that they have no fixed meaning, right? So and they're like tactical weapons and like tools for political change, like which in the absence of governments being unable to do anything radical, which seems out of their purview and whatever, that may be quite fruitful as well. I will say one more comment and then we'll move on. Keith also was obviously excellent. I really enjoyed it. Also thought about voters, and especially in Australia where we have compulsory voting. And with like, so for example, there's approximately 1 million negative gearers in Australia. Currently, in the next election, there will be 1 million new voters voting in Australia, like many of whom are obviously, and new being in terms of age, so just old enough now to vote. So obviously, many of them will not be homeowners, and also will be children of people who are not homeowners and therefore unable to be the bank of mum and dad. However, you also raised a very good point that will be a very long time away. And also, once they do own their home, how do we get their focus on profitability? And I think I thought that was very, very interesting, and further underscored also how good the WPR approach might, or how fruitful the WPR approach could be. So yeah, so thank you very much, and I thoroughly enjoyed your presentations. I hope my comments were just observations, really. And thank you also to you, Catherine. I think there's a lot of great people on this call, so we should definitely get to them now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Ray or Keith, do you want to quickly respond to anything, or do you want to hear from Mark? Okay, so then I think what we'll move on, and I'll invite Professor Mark Stevens, who's the Ian McTaggart Chair in Land, Property and Urban Studies at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Glasgow, also known, of course, to all of you as the co-convener of the network. So Mark, we'll invite your responses.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks very much to both speakers for your very interesting and insightful presentations. I think I better focus mostly on some response to Keith's provocation, shall we call it? I think if you looked at British housing policy going back to beginnings of the 20th century. I think you can see maybe maybe four critical junctures. And I think what we see is two things provoke change. One is catastrophic war, and the other is economic crisis. So it's undoubtedly the case that the First World War was the kind of crisis that provoked change in British housing policy that really set its direction for perhaps 70 years. So before the First World War, there was no real mainstream debate for heavily regulating private renting, which was the dominant tenure. And there was no real view of municipal public housing as a mainstream tenure. The then dominant Liberal Party, as the main non-conservative party, produced a very detailed land inquiry committee just before the First World War. And that is all about essentially making markets work, with a great interest in land markets and land taxation. So that changes with the First World War. Well known that, like I think probably all countries that were combatants, rent control was introduced supposedly as a temporary measure. And immediately after the war, the view was taken that the housing market was so disrupted that the hitherto rejected policy of subsidy for municipal housing was introduced. Now, I think if we're talking about critical junctures, as I think Rae suggested in her preliminary remarks, it takes some time before these things may be embedded. And it wasn't really until the 1930s that those twin policies of controlling and regulating the private rented sector and subsidies to build up a municipal sector were firmly established and supported by both of the mainstream political parties. The Second World War, of course, also an important critical juncture, although I think sometimes its importance is exaggerated. I think its main change in context of housing was the urgency of the crisis, and the change in politics, so the emergence of the first majority Labour government. But what I think is interesting is that it built on the institutions established in the interwar period. So there was probably more continuity than we sometimes think. But one thing that was important was the 1947 Planning Act, which nationalised development rights, and that I think is something that's missing from the Australian story. Next critical juncture, I would think, it would be the 1976 economic crisis, which led the UK government to seek a loan from the IMF, in return for which the UK had to cut public expenditure, and that is the point that public subsidy to municipal housing collapsed, and from which it never recovered. So that, I think, is a clear critical juncture. And of course, it facilitated the ideological shift towards what's commonly called neoliberalism. And that, of course, then set the scene for the Thatcher governments. If there were key structural things, as I've made clear, are important, but policy is also important. So the cluster of changes that were taken in 1988, which involved the deregulation of the private rented sector and the adoption of housing associations as the main providers of new social rented housing, which have kind of underpinned policy for the next 35, 40 years, were crucial and were underpinned by the new housing benefit system. I wouldn't go quite as far as Keith about analysing that, but certainly in the words of the minister at the time, let housing benefit take the strain was important. And then the global financial crisis, that set the tone for monetary policy for the long decade up to COVID, with ultra low interest rates and the introduction of quite stringent mortgage regulation that created unequal access to very cheap finance and contributed to some of the wealth inequalities and tenure inequalities that we have now. An observation about persistently favouring capital. I'm not quite sure that that's entirely right. For large parts of the 20th century, the small-scale landlord class was seen as dispensable by both political parties, and really since 2015, that kind of thing has emerged again with the kind of changes to tax treatment and of private renting. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mark. Can I invite either of the speakers to respond to any of the comments you'd like to pick up on? Keith or Rae, was there anything you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, no, well, thank you both for those really thoughtful comments and incredibly useful. And thank you also, Keith. I really enjoyed your intervention as well. I think, yeah, to pick up on a couple of things, Laura, I think you know, pointing to the other kind of crises on the horizon, I think connects well with what Mark was saying about, you know, these kind of very significant events acting as catalysts for these critical junctures in housing policy. And I particularly I was reading Le Corbusier a couple of days ago, and he was talking about you know, craftspeople lamenting the end of the arts and that arts and crafts movement, and his kind of response was a little bit how people are like, you know, well, AI is coming and you're just going to have to deal with it. And that was kind of his response 100 years ago was, well, you know, manufacturing's here, mass production, you're just going to have to deal with it. And so there was something really interesting in that as well. I also particularly appreciated Mark's thoughts. I think particularly around, and again picking up on Keith, the need to kind of really interrogate the different vested interests, but those vested interests that go beyond housing. So what, particularly in terms of the distributional kind of tools or technologies that we do have within the state system. You know, the property owning class hasn't come about by accident, as Keith puts it. It's through a taxation system that is effectively aggressive taxation system in Australia that does literally redistribute tax income to property owners. But equally, the way in which land banking and rent seeking is enabled through our system of land tenure. So it's really important that when we think about kind of the policy mechanisms in housing, I agree with Keith that it's really fiddling while Rome burns in many ways if they're not going to deal with those deeper structural challenges around a tax system and property and land within our systems. But yes, I can't see that happening either.
I think that the structural changes versus, you know, the other alternative pathways is something I want to come back to. But Keith, did you have anything you wanted to respond to first?
Yeah, just a few things actually. First of all, thank you, Laura, Mark, and Rae for discussion. I also just want to respond to Duncan actually, because I've just read your chat comment, Duncan, which I do want to respond to. If I can just paraphrase what Duncan said, because some of you may not be able to read it, but he thought the arguments I made were unconvincing because basically we have to understand that basically state interventions have failed, but so have kind of neoliberal market interventions failed. And there has to be some kind of way of managing through the middle somehow to manage and regulate a market-led housing system. I would say, with great respect, Duncan, and I've been a great admirer of your work, I would say that's unconvincing as well, simply because I don't think the word market is an accurate description of what's been happening and what is happening at the moment. The rhetoric is all about a market, but it's such a rigged market. You've actually got a situation where it's not really a market at all. It's a system which is set up to privilege the interests of investors and capital. It's not a market. It's not a level playing field. I see no evidence in the UK of any system other than that. I mean, there is obviously some payoff to some people who are disadvantaged, but by and large, when there's been critical junctures, as Mark quite rightly pointed out, it's always been the interest of capital which has won. So if we think of the global financial crisis, what was the solution? It was austerity. When we had the 1976 IMF crisis, as Mark mentioned, again, it was austerity, but there are alternative ways which could have been pursued. I mean, there was a simple solution put forward by the Conservative administration under Osborne and Cameron. They would privilege the interests of capital. They were privileging banks. I mean, I will also just say something very, very quickly about local authority as being a failure, because you rightly, well, you make the point there were problems in the local authority sector when you were growing up in the large cities of the UK, and of course there were. But housing, much of the public housing was a success story. There were many, many people who weren't stigmatized or disadvantaged, but professionals, households in work, living in public housing, and they were reluctant to move into owner occupation. Owner occupation in the UK in the 70s had reached a point where it wasn't actually increasing. So you've got a problem. How do you increase home ownership and the profitability of banks? But if people are quite happy in their public housing, well, there's only one way of doing it. You basically make public housing difficult. I knew you'd come in there, Duncan.
Can I just follow up on that and just ask, I mean, I guess what I read into Duncan's question was, can you actually effectively have this dual housing system whereby some parts of it are operating in terms of markets and some parts of it supported by government are not? We have seen that at historical moments in time where we had this dual system that did sort of work together. Can we ever get back there? Is it somewhere we want to go? Keith, that might be one for you.
I think Duncan wants to say something. You're going to have to switch on. Duncan, you're going to say something, aren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Duncan.
You're muted at the moment, Duncan. You've just got to press the button.
Can you hear me? I didn't want to be difficult, but what I want to know is the system that works. I do think there are markets, and we could have a long philosophical discussion. People do buy and sell things. They may be on markets that are imperfect and have failures, but we do have markets. So we still vote to have a big market-led system. So if we don't accept that, then we don't respect the democratic outcome. So we have to wrestle with that. At the same time, in terms of roles of the state, and what I've always found the argument of the left unconvincing is very often you get more concerned about the big issues of the return to capital rather than the housing outcomes that people get within the public housing sector. The city I was referring to was Glasgow. When I was a student, I grew up in Glasgow, and when I was a student in university there, 2/3 of the housing was owned by the municipality. I would suggest that public housing in Glasgow is not only now smaller than it was, it's much higher quality than it was. And actually, over the last 20 years, it's fared well relative to other places in the UK. I mean, and there is fairly firm evidence of this, largely because all of the public housing was transferred to the non-profit sector. So there's a very clear example where a status solution for housing was driving bad outcomes that have become much better in a more contestable and diverse non-market system. And at the same time, We have to think about who financed that. Well, a lot of money eventually came through the banks and the capital market, but it is highly regulated. My point is we have to think in reality in the systems, and this is true in Australia where public housing is tiny. I accept the point about you need to do important issues about land reform and the taxation of housing. And incidentally, I think every government that is going off down the road now saying it's going to do something better, and I live in Canada half the time, about another 3 years into this, all the commitments they've made about raising housing output and non-profit output will not be able to be financed out of their existing tax budgets. And the taxation of housing is going to be one of the really big policy debates in the next 5 years. Might be useful for this group perhaps to look at that. And it's not just about local property tax, it's going to be about wealth taxation because there's no redistribution left. So some of the things you might want, Keith, we might actually get out of that. But I do think we have to think about how do we envision, and I know I'm too much of an optimist, I always have been, but how do we envisage a better housing outcome? But I think actually going back to a status solution is not going to be the solution.
Rae, I think I want to let you respond to that because I think you had a response, and then we'll go to Ken.
Oh, only I agree with you, Duncan. I think the kind of the other half of my research is kind of going into the future, but looking at how other industries are dealing with this. And what I'm particularly interested in is kind of the construction of markets that hold developers to account after development. So I'm particularly interested in the way in which the New South Wales government have developed renewable energy zones, but that access to energy infrastructure in the same way as access to urban infrastructure is on a lease basis and is determined and assessed in terms of delivery of social value to the local communities, but also in terms of ability to deliver energy to the market as well. So it's a market of sorts, but it's one that is more kind of structured and formed through state intervention, which I think is where Keith is coming from as well, is that they're never pure markets, and in particularly in the case of housing, because land is such a finite economic entity that you're never going to get a perfect market, and so government has to intervene, but that it can't intervene to all extents. But that would be my contribution.
Thank you, Rae. Ken.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make two quite different points actually, but I think they're relevant to the discussion. The first is I'm working on a book about local tax reform, and in doing that, I've been reading a lot of history, not just history about local government, but history using history as methods to try to understand why some critical junctures don't lead to change and some do. And there's a really excellent book by Sam Friedman called Failed State, which came out a few years ago. And he used to be one of Michael Gove's education advisors, along with Dominic Cummings. But he's a really excellent thinker. He's now involved in homelessness work and local government reform. And his thesis, which is taken from a guy called Tintin, who wrote a book, I've got the title here, as The Death of Consensus, which was another book about the last 100 years of the UK. And they both kind of argue, it's really Tinlane's argument, is that there's been three major crises, existential crises in the UK. One to do with mass unemployment in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. One about the union employer kind of conflicts of the 60s, 70s, up to the Thatcher industrial relations changes. And the current one, which is about governability, accelerated by the global financial crisis and other things like that. But essentially making the case that the UK government is now ungovernable, that it's full of people who are not incentivized to be career civil servants, incentivized to be career politicians and good enough to do the job they do, but they have taken over government to the extent that they've centralised and they've overstretched massively and they're not able to function. And the question is, look, where does that go? And what they both argue for is much greater decentralisation of local government. So I think there are really interesting ways that history, you may not agree with that, it's actually a fairly structural economic ideological basis to it, even though Friedman would probably come from the right. But I think it's a really useful way of, so it's one of the ways of explaining why in Britain the council tax doesn't get properly reformed, for instance. We haven't reached the nexus of the crisis, as it were, yet. As government fails, and we continue to see the current government fail in much the same way that the previous governments have failed, which is quite interesting. So that's kind of one thing. I think there's real value in thinking about those broader structural forces and how they shape why policy can evolve sometimes and why it does in some ways. But the other thing that strikes me as listening to conversation is something that's not been talked about, which often comes up in these things, so I'm going to bring up, is populism and the extent to which in the UK context, will the Reform Party, it's already working assiduously at the margins of homelessness issues and asylum seekers, which are really housing issues in Britain. But are they surely not going to get involved in many of the other disjunctures in the housing system? And shouldn't we expect that? And that may, and it's not necessarily a traditionally, extreme right wing kind of approach they may take. It might not be as simple as that. Probably won't be. There'll be aspects of it which will be populist from a different group's perspective in order to win votes, etc. And I think there's particularly potentially large disruptive things that might happen as a result of that, where the electoral outcomes could be really quite complex for what that means for housing. Housing could become much more important because they'll see how significant it is for the many people who are so disrupted and dissatisfied. So anyway, just my tuppence worth.
Thank you, Ken. Either of the speakers, do you want to respond, or is there anyone else who wants to raise anything?
No, I enjoyed the provocations really. And Duncan, you made me think a lot about, middle of the road and whether there's a way through these difficult situations. I'm not actually necessarily arguing forward of kind of large-scale municipalisation. I just want to see a level playing field in the UK, so no one's advantaged or disadvantaged depending on their tenure. That's really the argument I want to make. At the moment, you're always going to be disadvantaged if you're a renter. You just haven't got the opportunities for financial gain, which is available for investors and homeowners. Until that's actually addressed, I really don't see any kind of solution to policies which are being put in place at the moment seem to me very, very unconvincing. I'm just not there when I hear people saying that the housing situation for low-income households is going to be addressed through the reforms undertaken by the Labour Party. Just don't see it. Same in Australia, in fact. I just think it's piss weak what's being proposed. Governments in both countries still seem to be obsessed with demand-side solutions. They pay rhetoric around supply, but they get caught up in the kind of arguments about planning. And actually, you really got to address, as Rae quite rightly said, the tax system, which is actually pushing people with money to invest in housing. But look, it's great we had that debate. And just coming back to you, Ken, look, they're going to look up Sam Friedman and his book or article on the death of consensus. I'm always interested in people from the right putting forward kind of interesting arguments. I do worry about populism. I don't think the populists have any intention at all of addressing anything. They just want to make people angry. In fact, the destruction of populism could only really come about if those issues were going to be addressed. So people like Farage and others, there's no way they're going to actually address the problems they've identified. So they want to keep people angry. And that's been the lesson, I think, of understanding Trump in the US. He's never going to address the problems of the US. He's just going to make sure that people who are angry become even more angry.
I'm going to go to Mark. We're rapidly running out of time, and I know Mark in particular has to catch a flight. So I'm happy to give Mark the last word if there's no other comments or questions. So go ahead, Mark.
Yes, thank you. I mean, a quick comment about the rise of populists, and of course that's happening across Europe as well as in the English-speaking countries. And I mean, the one thing you say about them is that they're not neoliberal. So we will see if they get into power some quite you know, non-market interventions, which may be rather incoherent. But the point I really wanted to come back to is influences on housing markets and distribution have increasingly moved away from the realm of housing policy and into financial policy and the way that central banks operate and financial markets and mortgage markets are regulated. But I think one of the things we've seen in the UK is that we had a boom and bust associated with deregulation in the late 80s and the early 90s. The government allowed a bust to happen. A lot of people had their houses repossessed, but house prices returned to pre-boom levels, and affordability was restored. What we've had since then, both with the global financial crisis and COVID, is that government has moved heaven and earth in order to protect existing homeowners from losing their homes for quite understandable reasons. But it also means that we don't get the kind of market corrections that I think they did have in the United States.
All right, thank you, Mark. Look, I think one of the ideas of getting us together is to incite debate, also to, I guess, identify crossovers in the work we're doing and the advocacy we're doing, and to make those connections. So I think we've certainly, done that if we haven't sort of resolved the problems or worked out the best way to use a crisis if indeed they exist. But I do want to thank everyone, especially our speakers, for coming tonight and for participating. So thank you to Rae, thank you to Keith, and thank you to both of our discussants. Um, Mark, I think we have another event coming up mid-October. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We have it on build to rent and institutional investment, which I think Nicola is here and is one of the presenters in that.
Yeah. So just watch your inboxes for an invitation to that. I hope you can all attend. But thank you everyone so much for coming, for sharing, and for your insights tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you, everyone.